Mike Tyson was and still is the youngest man to have ever become the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. At the age of 20 years, 145 days. When he stepped into the ring on February the 11th, 1990 against Buster Douglas, Mike Tyson's record was 37 wins, 0 losses, with 33 of those 37 wins coming by way of knockout. When he stepped into the ring that day, he was unbeatable. So everyone thought. He spent the night before that fight partying until the wee hours of the morning. And at the fight, those in his corner did not even bring to the fight that day the supplies that they normally would bring to deal with cuts or swelling. They just didn't bring any of it. No one in boxing saw what was coming that day. When Buster Douglas knocked Tyson senseless in the 10th round. But Mike Tyson wasn't the first nor the last to have arrogance knocked off his chin with the uppercut of reality. As a matter of fact, long before any of that happened, the prophet Isaiah would teach good King Hezekiah a lesson about the pitfalls of arrogance in times of success. You can hold your place if you have your Bibles open to 2 Chronicles 32. If you want to, hold your place there. But most of our thoughts today are going to come from the 39th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 39. And as we look at that chapter, we're going to see how this lesson plays out. What happened with Hezekiah, what Isaiah said to him, and how he learned his lesson the hard way. First of all, let's look at what Hezekiah's arrogance looked like. 2 major events happened before the events described in Isaiah 39. One of those was that Hezekiah recovered from a terrible illness by the power of God in answer to Hezekiah's prayer, a merciful answer from God to him. That's recorded in Isaiah chapter 38. But even prior to that, a great victory was enjoyed by God's people when the Lord miraculously delivered Judah from the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the world power at that time, and they had come and actually besieged Jerusalem, and it looked as though they would take Jerusalem. But in God's mercy, He spared them, and He did so miraculously when, as one person once put it, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers woke up dead one morning. But in the aftermath of those 2 tremendous blessings, a Babylonian ruler sent envoys to Judah, to Hezekiah, with gifts. First verse of Isaiah 39 tells us about that, about Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. Now, why would he do that? The text doesn't specifically tell us, but knowing somewhat of the history and how the Assyrians were the dominating power in the world, and how the Babylonians were trying to overthrow their power and would eventually. And upon hearing that Hezekiah's life had been spared, and this victory that Judah had over the Assyrians, It's no stretch of the imagination to conclude that the Babylonians saw in the nation of Judah a potential ally and a tremendous help in perhaps overthrowing Assyrian dominance. Verse 2 tells us that Hezekiah gladly welcomed that Babylonian envoy. And he gave them the grand tour of all of his storehouses and even his military armory. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Well, then Isaiah the prophet came to Hezekiah upon learning of this, and he had 3 questions for the king. Where did those men come from? What did they say? And what did they see? Well, Hezekiah answered 2 of those questions. They came from Babylon, and I showed them everything. To that, Isaiah gave this response, and it's clear. Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left. What was probably a shock to King Hezekiah was this declaration that a day was coming when everything that Hezekiah had showed the Babylonians, and then some, those Babylonians would come and take. He would even tell him in verse 7 of the chapter that even some of Hezekiah's own sons would be taken captive and made eunuchs in the palace of the Babylonian king. Now, all of this is shrouded under the umbrella of Hezekiah's arrogance. And we'll see a little more how that plays out when we look at some practical lessons and applications. But hopefully we've kind of got the picture in our minds that Hezekiah has experienced these 2 major points of success. He had overcome this terrible illness that was threatening to take his life. And he had experienced what was looking to be like almost being overthrown by the Assyrians. But God in His mercy had given them victory over the Assyrians. And so from a military standpoint, from a national standpoint, and from a personal standpoint, Hezekiah had experienced some tremendous success. And the success he had experienced had been known among others in the world. And that's why there were others that were coming, nations that were coming and sending him congratulations and bringing gifts. And we learn this in other places in the book of 2 Chronicles specifically. And here come the Babylonians, and they bring gifts. And Hezekiah essentially says, let me show you. Let me show you how rich we are. Let me show you all of the things that we possess. And so he just opens up the storehouses to this nation and shows them everything. And Isaiah comes to him later and says, that was a big mistake, because they're going to come take all of that. So from that very brief summary of what happened and what Hezekiah's arrogance looked like, let's consider what his arrogance should teach us. And I guess if you want one primary lesson to take home today, I would make it this. Our successes test our hearts as much as our trials do. And I don't know how often we think about our successes in that way. But let me call your attention back to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. And we read this in verse 31. In the matter of the envoys of the princes of Babylon, who had been sent to him to inquire about the sign that had been done in the land, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. We don't get that information in Isaiah 39, but we get it in this portion of God's Word. God's withdrawal from Hezekiah, he left him to himself, was for the purpose of allowing Hezekiah to handle this matter with the envoys without any additional revelation or guidance from the prophet. It wasn't that God had completely removed himself in any sense and in every sense. It seems that this is what was intended, was God removed himself in the sense that he didn't send the prophet first, which he could have done. He could have sent Isaiah to Hezekiah and say, hey, Babylonians are coming. Don't let them see anything. They've got ulterior motives. Could have done that, but he didn't. He withdrew himself. He didn't give Hezekiah specific guidance on how to handle that specific situation, and he did it to test him. How would Hezekiah respond to his life circumstances in the aftermath of those great victories, those great successes that he had experienced? The restoration of his health, the protection of his country. How often do we think about success as a challenge? As a challenge that demands a measured and wise response. I don't know that we think about successes that way generally. Is it not the case that we tend to view success as the reward? The reward of perhaps overcoming a challenge? And so that when we experience the success, we've experienced the blessing of God, the reward of God, and so now that we're experiencing that, we can kind of breathe a little easier and sit back and coast and just let things be as they are, or let things just happen naturally. Just sit back and sigh, and just enjoy the success. Isn't that really more how we view success, as opposed to viewing success as perhaps a test from God? How are we going to handle that? It's interesting in that light what Paul wrote in Philippians 4, verses 11 and 12. He said, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Now, I get it, and I understand how Paul could say, or how any of us could say, if perhaps this is actually true, I have learned how to deal with hunger. I have learned how to deal with need. I've learned how to deal with adversity. We often talk about adversity in that way. We talk about having to learn the challenges, or deal with the challenges, and learn how to deal with the disappointments, the trials, the hardships, the bad times. But Paul didn't just say he had learned how to deal with those things. He also said, I also learned how to deal with success. I learned how to abound. Do we think about abundance as something we have to learn how to deal with? Or do we often think of abundance as just the reward of having learned how to deal with something else? God purposely gave Hezekiah a series of victories, a series of successes. And then as the envoy from Babylon was coming, God said, I'm going to step back and let him deal with this himself and test him. Has he learned how to deal with success? When I think about congregations of God's people that enjoy prolonged periods of peace and prosperity and growth, two things. One, we should rejoice in that because it is a tremendous blessing to have that kind of environment in a congregation, but not at the expense of ignoring the pitfalls and challenges of success. When I think about us, if you're visiting with us today, glad you're here. But if I can talk to the Brown Trail Church specifically right now, that's kind of what we're experiencing, isn't it? By the grace of God, we have experienced a prolonged period of peace in the congregation. We've experienced of late, over the last handful of years, some growth. As I was looking back over some of our attendance numbers, you know, everybody took a hit during COVID, attendance-wise. There may be a variety of reasons for that, but in the aftermath of coming out of all of that turmoil, there's some congregations that have never gotten back to, as I've talked to other preachers and people at other places, there are a lot of places that haven't ever gotten back to their pre-COVID numbers we talk about. As I've looked over ours, we've not only gotten back to them, we've actually exceeded them, it seems like. And that's wonderful, and that's great. And there's a sense of peace and unity that pervades the congregation here. And we ought to rejoice in that, be thankful for that. But we also need to remember that there are pitfalls and challenges that come with success. Let me offer 3 of them for our consideration today. And these can be applied certainly congregationally, but in a sense, and in some ways, we can apply them individually. What are some of the pitfalls and challenges of success? Well, one, there's the challenge of perhaps stealing God's glory. Stealing God's glory. And if you don't think God cares whether or not His glory is stolen, then I would encourage you to refamiliarize yourself with the Bible. God's very much concerned about glory that is rightfully due Him. You go back and read this incident in Hezekiah's life, both from Isaiah 39 and from the account in 2 Chronicles. Something that Hezekiah doesn't mention to the Babylonian envoy was God. When Hezekiah was about to die, what did he do? He pleaded to God for his life. God gave him his life. When the Assyrians had besieged Jerusalem, what did Hezekiah do? He pleaded to God for help. God gave him help. When the Babylonian envoy came to see how things were in the aftermath of all that, where was Hezekiah saying, look what God did for us? You don't see that in the text. You just see Hezekiah showing them everything that they had. There's no reference to him saying that God was responsible for all of that. And that subtle shift in focus can result in magnifying ourselves instead of God. Periods of success and peace and prosperity can make us, if we're not careful, can make us want to make ourselves look good instead of wanting to make God look good. Reminds me of Genesis 11, verse 4. The people of Babel, in contemplating building this tower to the heavens, kind of all got together and said, hey, let's make a name for ourselves. Sometimes success leads us whether individually or congregationally, to steal God's glory. I would encourage all of us, especially our leaders, to never stop asking the central question with every decision that confronts them. The choices that we have, of the choices that we have, which one will best magnify God, advance His purposes, and honor His Word? That's it. Any other questions, and there are other questions that, depending on what's happening, need to be addressed and answered. That's the central one. Start with that question, answer that one correctly, then get to the other questions. Of the choices we have, which one will most magnify God, advance His purposes, and honor His Word? Until you've answered that question correctly, the others don't matter. In the second place, a second pitfall and challenge to success is letting your guard down. Letting your guard down. You know, in the aftermath of Hezekiah's recovery and all the gifts and accolades that came his way from surrounding nations, with all of that, Hezekiah was 10 feet tall and bulletproof until he wasn't. You know, if you're enjoying prosperity and peace, know this: Satan's got his eyes on you. If a congregation is enjoying prosperity and peace, Satan has his eyes on that church. Because the last thing he wants to see is a healthy, vibrant, active, unified church. He already has the lifeless, inactive, divided ones. He's looking for the others. And the same is true individually. If you're experiencing in your own personal life a period of peace and prosperity and goodness and all of that, Satan's got his eye on you too. Because he doesn't want that for you. We let our guard down, and he's got us right where he wants us. Pitfall number 3. Forgetting to care about the future. Forgetting to care about the future. I want you to look at verse 8 of Isaiah chapter 39. Bible students are divided on how to understand what Hezekiah meant when he said this. But this is right after the prophet Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "You made a mistake. You're going to regret having showed the Babylonians everything you showed them, because the day's coming when they're coming back and they're going to take all of this for themselves and then some, even some of your own family." It is to that Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, "There will be peace and security in my days." Now here's the discrepancy. Here's where not everyone comes down on the same side of things. Some see this statement as humble gratitude on Hezekiah's part. In other words, I can't argue with the Word of God. What you've just told me is from God, and His Word is always good. I accept that. I'm just grateful that there will be peace and security in my time, even if it doesn't mean peace and security in the time of those that come after me. I'm at least happy for that. Others, however, see Hezekiah as expressing a more prideful disregard for the future, where the prophet just tells him about what's going to happen to his own people and his own stuff and the nation and all of that going into the future, and it's as if Hezekiah says, "Well, I can accept that because, hey, I get to live peacefully. I'll get peace in my day. I'm not really worried about the future." So which is it? Well, I don't know. But I'll say this. I think that second viewpoint is possible. And since it is, I think, at least theoretically possible, let's learn a lesson that such an attitude should teach us, if indeed that was what he was expressing. And that lesson is this: present decisions affect future generations, and we ought to care about that. Individually, on a family scale, and congregationally. The decisions that we make today will affect future generations, and we ought to care about that. What kind of church will our decisions today leave for our children and our grandchildren? That's a sobering question, isn't it? When it comes to my personal life, what kind of environment am I going to leave for my future family based upon the decisions that I'm making today? You know, God sees the whole picture. Declaring the end from the beginning, Isaiah 46, verse 10. And while we can't see the end from the beginning like He can, we're not omniscient like He is, but He has given us the wisdom to be able to see how certain choices and decisions will affect the future. And He wants us to think about that. He wants us to be concerned about the future. Our own individually, the futures of our families, the futures of our churches, of His churches, His congregations. And so if Hezekiah was taking a more prideful approach and saying, well, I can't do anything about the future, but hey, I'm going to enjoy my life, then let's learn to not be that way. When pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with the humble is wisdom. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Our prayer should ever be, Father, grant us success according to your will, but in that success, protect us from sabotaging it with our own pride. We should pray that God would open our eyes to the challenges of success, and that He would keep our eyes focused always on His glory and not our own. Has pride filled your heart because things are going well? I know it's not true of every person, of every family, of every congregation. But if it is true in your case, if things are going well for you right now, how are you responding to that? Are you seeing in those successes a test, a challenge to make sure that you handle those successes the right way? If you're not seeing it that way, let me encourage you to change the way you're looking at your own life. Are you setting yourself up for a dose of humility? Why not humble yourself the easy way instead of waiting for God to humble you the hard way? The choice is yours, just as it is mine. Let's make the right choice. Let us stand and sing.